The afternoon sun beat down on the Bennett family's backyard in Oakridge, just outside Charlotte, where paper lanterns swayed gently above folding tables draped in red checkered cloth. The air hung thick with the smell of pulled pork smoking on the grill, mixed with the sweet tang of barbecue sauce and freshly cut grass. I stood near the drink cooler, a sweating bottle of sweet tea in my hand, watching my father Craig laugh at something my brother Derek had just said. The sound carried across the yard, full and genuine in a way it never seemed to be when he talked to me. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Around us, neighbors mingled with extended family. Derek's colleagues from the bank stood in tight clusters discussing interest rates and market trends, and my mother Linda flitted between groups making sure everyone had enough food on their plates. It was Dad's 65th birthday, and the whole neighborhood had turned out to celebrate a man who'd spent 40 years as a construction foreman, building half the developments in this part of town. I'd almost skipped it. Standing in my loft that morning, staring at the calendar reminder on my phone, I'd felt that familiar weight in my chest. 4 years of these gatherings, 4 years of subtle digs and not so subtle disappointments. But something made me come anyway. Maybe it was the envelope sitting on my desk, the one with the government contract details and the wire transfer confirmation. Maybe it was the keys to the helicopter, still new enough that touching them felt surreal. Or maybe I just wanted to see their faces one more time before everything changed. Derek stood by the grill now, one hand gesturing broadly as he held court with 3 of his banking buddies. His polo shirt was crisp despite the heat, his khakis perfectly pressed. His leather loafers probably cost more than most people's monthly rent. At 37, he'd cultivated the look of success with precision, every detail calculated to broadcast stability and achievement. His wife Vanessa perched on a lawn chair nearby, her sundress clearly expensive, her nails freshly manicured, laughing at appropriate moments in his story even though she'd probably heard it a dozen times. They just bought a 4,000-square-foot house in the new development on the north side, the kind with a 3-car garage and a media room, financed to the hilt but impressive enough to photograph well for social media. I caught Mom's eye across the yard and she waved me over to help carry out more cornbread from the kitchen. As I crossed the grass, I passed Mrs. Patterson from next door, who'd known me since I was in diapers. She smiled warmly and squeezed my arm. "That boy of yours is doing just fine," she told my mother last month, according to the neighborhood gossip chain. Mom had apparently just smiled tightly and changed the subject. Inside the kitchen, Mom handed me a basket lined with a cloth napkin, steam rising from the golden squares of cornbread beneath. "Your brother's talking about the promotion he's up for," she said, not quite meeting my eyes. "Assistant VP of Regional Operations. Can you imagine?" I made a non-committal sound, balancing the basket carefully. Mom wiped her hands on her apron, then added in that tone she'd perfected over the years, the one that sounded casual but landed like a judgment. "You know, Marcus, it's not too late to go back to school. Get a real degree. Derek's company is always hiring for IT support positions." I could ask him to put in a word. The cornbread basket felt heavier suddenly. "I'm doing fine, Mom." "Really?" She pursed her lips, that expression that said she disagreed but wouldn't argue in the middle of a party. "You're 32 years old, living in that tiny apartment doing whatever it is you do on computers. When are you going to settle down? Get serious about your future?" Before I could answer, Dad's voice boomed from the back door. "Linda, we need more of that slaw out here." She patted my shoulder once, almost apologetically, then brushed past me back to the refrigerator. I carried the cornbread outside, setting it on the main table where plates of baked beans and coleslaw were already picked over. The party had reached that comfortable midpoint where everyone had eaten their first round and loosened up enough for the conversations to get louder. Derek's laugh carried over the general noise, and I saw him slap one of his friends on the back, clearly the center of attention. Vanessa had her phone out, angling for the perfect shot of the party scene, probably already composing the caption about family and blessings and gratitude. I found a spot near the fence, in the shade of the old oak tree that had been there since before the house was built. From here I could observe without being pulled into conversations I didn't want to have. James had texted me twice already asking how it was going, if I'd told them yet. "Not yet," I'd replied. "Soon." He'd sent back a helicopter emoji and the words, "This is going to be legendary." The thing was, I hadn't planned it this way. When I'd started the business 4 years ago, fresh off a layoff from a tech company that had outsourced my entire department, I'd just been trying to survive. I'd taken my severance, my savings, and thrown everything into building a cybersecurity consulting firm from my living room. Those first 6 months, I'd lived on ramen and black coffee, working 18-hour days, cold calling potential clients, building systems and protocols that I knew were better than what most companies were using. The family had known I was doing something with computers, but they'd never really asked for details. Derek had made a joke at Thanksgiving that year about me being a professional video game player. Mom had sighed and said she hoped I'd figure things out eventually. Dad had just looked tired and disappointed, the same expression he'd worn when I dropped out of the engineering program at State to pursue computer science at the community college instead. But slowly, painfully, the business had grown. 1 client became 2, 2 became 5. I'd brought on James, then 2 more developers, then a salesperson. We'd landed a contract with a regional hospital network, then a manufacturing company, then a chain of hotels. 18 months ago, we'd gotten our first really big break. A financial services firm that needed a complete security overhaul. The contract was worth more than I'd made in the previous 3 years combined. I kept quiet about it, just kept working, kept building. 6 months ago, the email had come through. A government agency I couldn't name, looking for a complete data protection and threat assessment system. The RFP was thick as a phone book, the requirements complex enough that most of the big firms would struggle to meet them all. But I'd been building toward exactly this kind of work without even knowing it. We'd spent 3 months on the proposal, every detail checked and rechecked, every requirement exceeded. When the award letter came through, when I saw the number with all those zeros, I'd sat in my office for 20 minutes just staring at the screen. The contract was for $12 million over 3 years, with options for extension. My cut, after paying the team and covering expenses, would set me up for life. But more than that, it validated everything I'd been working toward. We were no longer a scrappy startup. We were a legitimate player. I'd kept it quiet, telling only James and our lawyer Rebecca. Part of me wanted to announce it immediately, to walk into the next family dinner and lay the contract on the table. But a wiser part held back. I'd learned over the years that Derek didn't handle my successes well. When I'd bought my first new car with my own money, he'd made comments about it being a basic model, nothing compared to his leased BMW. When I'd mentioned landing the hospital contract, he'd changed the subject to talk about his bonus structure. It was easier to just stay under the radar. But the helicopter, that had been an impulse. We'd closed a follow-up deal 2 weeks ago. Another government subcontract that James had pulled in through his connections. The money hit the account on a Tuesday, and by Friday I was at the aviation company signing papers. It was excessive, impractical, absolutely unnecessary. But standing on the tarmac after the first flight with the instructor, Charlotte spread out below me like a circuit board, I'd felt something shift. This wasn't about transportation. It was about having arrived at a place I'd been told I'd never reach. Now, standing in the shade of the oak tree at my father's birthday party, I checked my phone. The pilot I'd hired had texted 15 minutes ago. On schedule. It had 25 minutes. You sure about this? I typed back a single word. Yes. Derek's voice suddenly rose above the crowd, and I looked up to see him gesturing in my direction. Marcus, get over here. Some of the guys were asking what you're up to these days. There was something in his tone, that edge of challenge disguised as friendly interest. I pushed off the tree and walked over, feeling the weight of attention shift toward me. Derek's colleagues looked at me with polite curiosity, drinks in hand, probably wondering who the underdressed guy in the jeans and plain t-shirt was. So Marcus here is our family's tech genius, Derek said, and there was definitely an edge to it now. He does some kind of computer consulting thing. I tried to get him to apply at the bank. We've got a great IT department, but he prefers the freelance life. One of Derek's friends, a guy in an expensive watch and golf shirt, smiled. Consulting, huh? That's a tough field. Lot of competition from the big firms. Derek jumped in before I could respond. Yeah, Marcus has been at it for years now. Still working out of that apartment in Uptown. But hey, no boss to answer to, right? Freedom and all that. Vanessa added her voice, sweet as poison honey. We keep telling him he should settle down, get a stable position somewhere. Maybe meet a nice girl. But Marcus likes to do things his own way. The implication hung there that my way was the wrong way, the immature way. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. I felt my jaw tighten but kept my expression neutral. The business is doing well, I said simply. Oh, I'm sure, Derek said, taking a long pull from his beer. But at some point you've got to think about the future. Real estate, retirement accounts, building something permanent. I was just telling these guys about the promotion track I'm on, and it got me thinking about security, having something solid underneath you. Dad had drifted over, drawn by the gathering crowd. He stood next to Derek, and the physical similarity was striking, the same broad shoulders, the same way of standing with feet planted wide. What are we talking about? He asked, and Derek grinned. Just catching Marcus up on the real world, Pops. Explaining how the grown-up side of things works. A few people chuckled, uncomfortable laughs that acknowledged the tension but didn't want to address it directly. Part 1 of this story really begins 4 years earlier, though I didn't know it at the time. I'd been working at a tech firm in downtown Charlotte, a mid-sized company that handled data management for retail chains. It wasn't exciting work, but it paid decently, and I'd convinced myself that steady was enough. Then came the Monday morning meeting where they announced the restructuring. My entire department gone, outsourced to a firm in India that could do the same work for a third of the cost. They gave us 2 weeks and a severance package that felt more like hush money than compensation. I remember sitting in my apartment that night, the termination letter on the coffee table, my laptop open to job search sites that all seemed to be listing the same positions for half what I'd been making. Derek had called that evening, ostensibly to check on me after Mom told him the news, but really to offer his particular brand of advice. Look man, it's a tough market, but you've got to be realistic about your skill level. Maybe it's time to consider something more stable. The bank is always looking for people who can reset passwords and troubleshoot the printer network. It wouldn't be glamorous, but it would be steady. Something in his tone, that mix of pity and condescension, had lit a fire in me. I'd spent the next 3 days barely sleeping, just researching. I looked into every cybersecurity breach that had made the news in the past year, reading the post-mortem reports, understanding where the systems had failed. I called every contact I'd made in my 6 years in the industry, asking what problems they were facing, what solutions they needed. And I realized something. The big consulting firms were too expensive and too slow for mid-sized companies, but those companies were facing the same threats as the Fortune 500s. There was a gap in the market, and I had the skills to fill it. The first client came through a former colleague who'd moved to a regional hospital. They'd failed an audit, needed to overhaul their patient data security, and had a limited budget. I quoted them half what the big firms would charge and promised I could do it in 6 weeks. I worked 16-hour days, building custom protocols, training their staff, documenting everything obsessively. When I finished early and under budget, they referred me to 2 other hospitals in their network. Suddenly I had 3 clients and more work than I could handle alone. That's when I brought in James Richardson. We'd gone to community college together, both scholarship kids trying to prove we belonged. He'd gone into network architecture while I'd focused on security systems, but we'd stayed in touch over the years. When I told him what I was building, he quit his job the next day and joined me. We worked out of my apartment too. Desks crammed into my living room, surviving on delivery food and the absolute conviction that we were onto something real. The family didn't get it. At Christmas that first year, Derek had dominated the dinner conversation talking about his promotion to senior loan officer, the company car they were giving him, the bonus structure he'd negotiated. When Mom asked what I was doing, I tried to explain about the hospital contracts, about the security systems we were building. Dad had nodded politely, but I could see his eyes glaze over. It's good you're staying busy, he'd said. But eventually you need to think about getting back into a real job. Benefits, health insurance. A 401k. Derek had raised his glass in a mock toast. To Marcus, the eternal entrepreneur. Let us know when you need a loan, little brother. I'd gone home that night and worked until dawn, fueled by anger and determination. Over the next year we landed 8 more clients. I hired 2 developers, then a salesperson, then moved us out of my apartment and into a small office space. The revenue started to climb steadily. We weren't getting rich, but we were profitable, growing, building a reputation for being fast, thorough, and significantly cheaper than the big firms without sacrificing quality. James and I took modest salaries and plowed everything else back into the business. At family gatherings, I started saying less about work. It was easier than dealing with the subtle dismissals, the way Derek would nod along and then immediately pivot to talking about his own career moves. When I did mention something like landing the financial services contract, he'd find a way to minimize it. "Oh, that's great, but you know those contracts can be pretty volatile. Not like having a steady corporate position." Meanwhile, Vanessa would post another Instagram story about their new furniture, their weekend at the lake house they'd rented, their reservations at the newest trendy restaurant, all of it financed by credit cards and a mortgage that I knew from Mom's casual mentions was stretching them thin. 18 months ago, after the financial services contract closed, I treated myself to a nice watch. Not crazy expensive but nice. A Rolex Submariner that I'd wanted since I was a kid flipping through my dad's magazines. I wore it to Easter dinner and Derek noticed immediately. "Nice watch," he'd said, picking up my wrist to examine it. "What is that, a replica? They make pretty good fakes these days." When I told him it was real, his expression had flickered with something I'd seen before. That mix of surprise and irritation. Must be nice to spend money on toys instead of investing in your future. I'd let it go, just pulled my wrist back and changed the subject. But the watch became a reminder every time I glanced at it. A reminder that I was building something real, even if they couldn't see it. Every client meeting, every contract negotiation, every late night solving problems that seemed impossible, they were all steps toward something bigger. When the government RFP landed in my inbox 6 months ago, I'd known immediately it was the opportunity I'd been working toward. The scope was massive, the requirements complex, the timeline aggressive. Most firms would assemble a team of 20 people and spend a year on the proposal alone. James and I did it in 3 months with our core team of 6. The day the award letter came, Rebecca called me into her office and just handed me the printed email without saying anything. I read it 3 times before the reality sank in. We'd won $12 million over 3 years, with extension options that could double that. It was more money than I'd imagined making in a lifetime, and it was just the beginning. The contract would open doors to other government work, other large-scale projects. We'd arrived. I wanted to tell someone, to celebrate, to share the victory. But sitting in Rebecca's office, I thought about how it would go. I'd tell Mom and she'd be happy but wouldn't really understand what it meant. Dad would nod and probably ask if it was union work, confusing tech contracts with his construction world. And Derek would find a way to minimize it, to explain why it wasn't as impressive as it seemed, to remind everyone that contracts can fall through, that government work is unpredictable, that real success looks like his career path, not mine. So I kept quiet. I told James and Rebecca and swore them to secrecy. We celebrated with expensive whiskey in the office after everyone else had gone home, making plans for how we'd scale up to handle the work. I moved the money into accounts, set up the corporate structures Rebecca recommended, started the hiring process for the additional staff we'd need. And I bought the helicopter. It was absurd, I knew that. A Robinson R-44, 4 seats, beautiful and completely impractical for everyday life. But I'd always loved flying, had taken a few lessons years ago before money got tight. The aviation company offered a lease-to-own program, and after the follow-up contract James landed made the purchase easy, I couldn't resist. I spent 3 weeks doing intensive training, getting my license, learning to handle the machine with confidence. Flying over Charlotte, seeing the city from above, I felt like I'd broken through some invisible ceiling that had always been pressing down on me. The plan to arrive at Dad's party by helicopter hadn't been calculated revenge. It started as a joke with James over beers one night. Imagine their faces, he'd said, if you just dropped out of the sky in the middle of Derek's speech about fiscal responsibility. We'd laughed, but the idea stuck. The more I thought about it, the more it felt right. Not as revenge, but as a statement. A way of saying without words that I'd made it on my own terms, in my own way, and they'd all been wrong about me. Standing in the backyard now, Derek still holding court about the importance of traditional career paths and long-term planning, I felt my phone buzz. The pilot. 5 minutes out. Your landing zone is clear. I glanced up at the sky, still empty but about to change. Derek was saying something about how some people never learn to think beyond the short term, never develop real maturity. Dad was nodding along, his beer sweating in the afternoon heat. Vanessa had her phone up, probably recording Derek's wisdom for her followers. Mrs. Patterson caught my eye from across the yard and smiled, that knowing look that suggested she understood more than she let on. I smiled back, then checked my watch. 4 minutes. The backyard was big enough, barely. We'd measured it on satellite images, confirmed it with the pilot. The oak tree was far enough to the side, the house set back enough from the landing zone. It would be tight but doable. I wondered if Dad would be angry about the grass. 3 minutes. Derek's voice carried on, something about how he tried to help me, tried to guide me toward stability, but some people just have to learn things the hard way. A few of his colleagues were starting to look uncomfortable, sensing that this had shifted from friendly ribbing to something else. Mom had come back outside and was watching with a pinched expression, clearly wanting Derek to stop but not willing to intervene. 2 minutes. I could hear it now, faint but distinct, the thump of rotor blades cutting through air. A few people cocked their heads, puzzled by the sound. Derek paused mid-sentence, distracted. "What is that?" someone asked. "Sounds like a helicopter," Dad said, shading his eyes to scan the sky. 1 minute. The sound was louder now, unmistakable, and people were starting to point. I saw it crest over the tree line, the sun catching the glass, the sleek body of the Robinson banking slightly as it approached. The pilot was good, bringing it in steady and controlled, the rotor wash starting to disturb the paper lanterns and tablecloths. Conversations stopped. Everyone was watching now, some stepping back nervously, others pulling out phones to record. Derek's voice cut through the noise, annoyed. "Who the hell is landing a helicopter in the backyard? This is a residential neighborhood. You can't just..." He trailed off as the helicopter settled lower, the skids reaching for the grass. The pilot held it steady, perfect control, then touched down light as a feather in the center of the yard, exactly where we'd planned. The rotors began to slow, the pitch of the engine dropping, the wash settling from hurricane to strong breeze to nothing. In the sudden quiet, every eye in the yard locked on the helicopter. The door opened and I started walking toward it, unhurried, letting the moment breathe. I could feel their stares, hear the confused murmurs, sense the gears turning as they tried to understand what they were seeing. The pilot gave me a thumbs up and I returned it, then turned back to face the crowd. Derek's expression was frozen somewhere between confusion and disbelief. Vanessa's mouth hung slightly open, her phone forgotten in her hand. Mom looked like she was trying to solve a puzzle. Dad just stared, his beer halfway to his lips. I let the silence stretch another beat, then spoke loud enough for everyone to hear. My voice was calm, conversational, like I just arrived in a regular car instead of dropping from the sky. "Sorry I'm late, everyone. Had a conference call with some clients that ran long. Happy birthday, Dad." The silence that followed my greeting stretched like taffy, thick and unnatural in the afternoon heat. I watched Derek's face cycle through emotions faster than I could name them, confusion giving way to something harder, something that looked almost like anger. Around us, the yard remained frozen in that peculiar stillness that comes after something impossible happens, when the brain is still trying to reconcile what the eyes have seen. Mrs. Patterson had both hands pressed to her chest, her expression caught between delight and shock. Dad's beer bottle hung suspended in midair, condensation dripping onto his shoe. Mom looked like she wanted to speak but couldn't find the words, her mouth opening and closing without sound. Vanessa recovered first, her influencer instincts kicking in as she raised her phone and started recording, though her hands shook slightly. Derek took 3 steps toward the helicopter, stopped, then turned back to me with an expression I'd seen countless times before. It was the look he got when something didn't fit into his worldview, when reality refused to arrange itself according to his expectations. His voice came out rough, like he'd swallowed gravel. "What is this, Marcus? What are you doing?" I moved past him toward the drink cooler, my footsteps steady on grass that was probably damaged from the rotor wash, but I'd write Dad a check for new sod later. The helicopter sat behind me like an exclamation point, impossible to ignore or explain away. I pulled out another sweet tea, twisted off the cap, took a long drink. The cold liquid helped settle something in my chest, that tight coil of nervous energy that had been building all morning. I'd imagined this moment 100 times over the past 2 weeks, played out different versions in my head while lying awake at 3 in the morning. None of my imagined scenarios had captured this feeling, this strange calm that had settled over me like a blanket. "Coming to wish Dad a happy birthday," I said, keeping my tone light. Thought I'd make an entrance since I was running late. Derek's face flushed red, that telltale sign that his temper was rising. He jabbed a finger toward the helicopter, his voice climbing. You can't just land a helicopter in a residential backyard. There are regulations, noise ordinances, not to mention it's dangerous. What if you'd hit the house? What if someone got hurt? Dad found his voice then, though it came out quieter than usual. Marcus, is that yours? The question hung in the air and I felt every eye in the yard lock onto me again. One of Derek's banking colleagues, the guy with the expensive watch, had his phone out too now, probably Googling how much a helicopter costs. I could almost see the numbers clicking through his head. Watch him reassess everything Derek had said about his little brother's computer hobby. I took another sip of tea, let the moment breathe. Yeah, Dad, it's mine. Bought it a couple weeks ago. Been meaning to tell you but wanted to surprise you for your birthday. Mom made a sound somewhere between a gasp and a laugh, her hand flying to her mouth. Linda Bennett, who'd spent 37 years as an elementary school teacher, who'd raised 2 sons on a tight budget, who clipped coupons and bought store brands and saved aluminum foil to reuse, was staring at a helicopter in her backyard. A helicopter that belonged to her younger son, the one she'd been worried about just an hour ago. Derek's jaw worked like he was chewing words he couldn't quite spit out. Finally he managed, you bought a helicopter. You bought a helicopter. The disbelief in his voice would have been funny if it wasn't so raw. There was something else underneath it too. Something that sounded like betrayal. As if I'd broken an unspoken agreement by succeeding without his permission. His friend with the watch spoke up, voice carefully neutral. Those are 44s, run what, $500,000? More depending on the package? Before I could answer, Derek cut in. He probably leased it. Or rented it for the day. Right, Marcus? This is just some stunt for attention. I met his eyes and saw genuine need there. Desperate hope that this could be explained away, minimized, reduced to something that fit back into the box he'd built for me. I thought about letting him have it, about nodding and going along with the easier story. But that tight coil in my chest had loosened completely now, replaced by something that felt almost like peace. The kind that comes from finally telling the truth. Bought it outright, I said. Paid in full. The company that sold it to me threw in a sweet maintenance package and hangar space at the regional airport. I've got my license too, finished the certification 3 weeks ago. Flew it here myself today, though I hired an instructor to ride along just to be safe. The words came out easy, conversational, like I was discussing a used car instead of a piece of aviation equipment that costs more than most people's houses. The yard had gone quiet again, but it was a different kind of quiet now. Before it had been shock, frozen confusion. This was active processing, dozens of people simultaneously rearranging their understanding of who Marcus Bennett was. I could see it happening in real time, watch the mental adjustments being made. Mrs. Patterson's expression had shifted to something that looked like pride. Dad still looked stunned, but there was something else creeping in around the edges of his eyes. Maybe the beginning of questions he hadn't thought to ask before. One of the neighbors, Bill from 3 houses down who worked in insurance, cleared his throat. That's quite an achievement, Marcus. What line of work did you say you were in again? Derek jumped in before I could respond, his voice tight. He does computer consulting. Freelance stuff. His tone suggested this explained nothing, that it made the helicopter even more impossible to comprehend. Bill frowned, clearly doing math that wasn't adding up. Must be some pretty high-end consulting. I shrugged, taking another drink of tea. The ice clinked against the glass and the sound seemed unnaturally loud. It's been a good few years. The business has grown faster than I expected. We landed some major contracts recently, government work, mostly cybersecurity and data protection. Turns out there's a lot of demand for what we do. I kept my voice casual, understated, but I watched the information land. Government contracts, major clients. These weren't the words of someone barely scraping by in a tiny apartment. Vanessa had lowered her phone finally, her perfectly maintained composure cracking around the edges. Government contracts? Like with actual agencies? Her voice carried a note of incredulity that might have stung if I wasn't riding this strange wave of calm. Yeah, I said. Can't name them, obviously, security clearances and all that, but yeah. Real agencies, real budgets. We've been building toward this for about 4 years now. 4 years. The time frame hung in the air and I saw Mom do the calculation, watched her realize that I'd been building this the whole time they'd been worrying about me. 4 years of family dinners where she'd hinted about applying to Derek's bank. 4 years of Christmas gatherings where Dad had suggested I think about trade school, get a union card like he had. 4 years of Derek's condescending advice about the real world and fiscal responsibility. And through all of it, I'd been quietly constructing something they'd never imagined. Derek's friend with the watch spoke again, and this time his voice carried a note of respect that hadn't been there before. Government cybersecurity? That's serious business. My firm handles some financial sector security consulting, and those contracts are incredibly competitive. The clearance requirements alone can take months. He looked at me with new eyes, professional curiosity replacing polite disinterest. What kind of team are you running? 6 core people right now, I said, though we're hiring for the new contracts. Mix of developers, security analysts, network architects. Everyone's got at least 10 years experience in their specialty. We focus on mid-sized implementations that the big consulting firms won't touch because the margins aren't fat enough, but the security needs are just as critical. The words came easy because I'd said them 100 times to potential clients, but hearing them here, in this backyard where I'd been dismissed and discounted for years, they carried different weight. Dad finally set down his beer, his construction-weathered hands hanging at his sides. His voice when he spoke was quiet, almost cautious. Marcus, why didn't you tell us about any of this? It was a fair question, maybe the fairest one anyone had asked. I looked at him, at the genuine confusion in his face, and felt something shift in my chest again. How do you explain to your father that you stopped sharing your life because sharing meant opening yourself up to being diminished? How do you say that silence felt safer than celebration? I tried to, I said finally. Not about the helicopter, obviously, that just happened. But I've mentioned the contracts, the clients, the growth. Remember last Thanksgiving when I talked about the hospital network deal? Or Easter when I mentioned the financial services contract? I'd pause and let the memories surface, watch them, remember how those conversations had gone. Derek had changed the subject to his bonus structure. Mom had asked when I was going to get a real job with benefits. Dad had nodded politely and then asked Derek about his promotion timeline. The silence that followed was different again, heavier. This one carried the weight of missed connections, of assumptions made and never questioned. Mom's eyes were shiny now, her hand still pressed to her chest. I didn't realize, she started, then stopped. You were so quiet about everything. I thought you were struggling. I said, and it was true. For the first year, maybe 2, I was absolutely struggling. 18-hour days, ramen for dinner. Wondering if I'd made a catastrophic mistake leaving the corporate world. But that's what building something takes. You struggle through the hard part because you believe there's something better on the other side. I paused, choosing my words carefully. I guess I got tired of explaining what I was doing when it seemed like nobody really wanted to know. That landed hard and I saw it hit. Mom looked stricken. Dad's expression crumbled into something that might have been regret. Even Vanessa had the grace to look uncomfortable, probably remembering her comments about me needing to settle down and get serious. But Derek's face had gone from red to pale, his jaw so tight I could see the muscle jumping. His whole body radiated tension, coiled like a spring wound too tight. So what, he said, his voice dangerous and low. You've been secretly running some tech empire while letting us all think you were barely getting by? You've been playing the struggling entrepreneur while apparently flying around in helicopters? Why, Marcus? What was the point of lying to everyone? I wasn't lying, I said, keeping my voice level. I just stopped trying to convince you that I knew what I was doing. There's a difference. Every time I shared something, it got minimized or dismissed or turned into concern about my future. So I stopped sharing. I kept my head down, did the work, built the business. I didn't owe anyone daily progress reports. Derek took another step closer and now his voice was rising. You made us look like fools. All this time, all the advice we gave you, the help we offered, and you were just laughing at us behind our backs. I could feel the party's attention laser focused on us now. This confrontation that had been brewing beneath the surface for years finally boiling over. But that strange calm hadn't left me. If anything, it was settling deeper, giving me a clarity I'd never felt in these family dynamics before. I never laughed at anyone, I said. And I never asked for advice I didn't want. You offered it anyway, usually in the form of telling me everything I was doing wrong. As for help, I looked at him steadily. Derek, you haven't helped me with anything since we were kids. What you did was judge me for not following your path, and then use my choices as a way to feel better about yours." His face went red again, that flush creeping up from his collar. "How dare you," he started, but Dad cut him off. "Boys, this isn't the time. We're here to celebrate, not fight." His voice carried that weary authority he'd always had, the foreman's tone that expected to be obeyed. But something had shifted, and I felt it in the way I stood my ground, in the way I didn't automatically defer. "You're right, Dad," I said. "This isn't the time for a fight. I came here to wish you happy birthday and enjoy some barbecue." The helicopter was maybe dramatic, I'll admit that. But I wanted you to see that I'm doing okay. Better than okay, actually. I'm doing great. And I wanted you to see it in a way that couldn't be dismissed or minimized or explained away as luck or timing or anything except what it is. Hard work that paid off. Mom had tears rolling down her cheeks now, though I couldn't quite read what they meant. Mrs. Patterson was smiling openly, that bright expression that said she'd always known I'd figure things out. Bill, the insurance guy, looked impressed and maybe a little envious. Derek's banking colleagues had shifted their body language, no longer standing quite so close to him, their professional instincts recognizing a successful peer rather than a struggling little brother. The pilot had stayed in the helicopter this whole time, but now he opened the door and stepped out, probably checking if we were done with the dramatic confrontation. He was older, maybe 60, with the weathered look of someone who'd spent decades in the air. He caught my eye and gave a subtle questioning look, and I nodded. Everything was fine, or at least as fine as it was going to get. Derek was staring at the helicopter like it had personally offended him. His hands clenched into fists at his sides. Vanessa had moved closer to him, one hand on his arm, probably feeling the tension radiating off him. She whispered something I couldn't hear, and he shook his head sharply, jaw still tight. I felt a flicker of something that might have been pity. This was supposed to be another family gathering where he was the star, the successful son with the corporate position and the big house and the bright future. Instead, his little brother had literally dropped out of the sky and shattered that narrative. But the pity faded as quickly as it came, because I remembered all the years of his condescension, all the subtle and not so subtle digs, all the times he'd made me feel small for daring to try something different. He'd had plenty of opportunities to be supportive, to be curious about what I was building, to treat me like an equal instead of a charity case. He'd chosen otherwise, and now he was facing the consequences of those choices. Dad moved first, walking toward me with slow, deliberate steps. When he reached me, he stood for a long moment just looking at my face, like he was seeing me for the first time. Then he did something he hadn't done since I was a teenager. He pulled me into a hug, his big construction worker arms wrapping around me tight. "I'm proud of you, son," he said quietly, his voice rough. "I wish I'd known to be proud sooner, but I'm proud now." Something in my chest cracked open at those words, and I hugged him back, feeling the solid reality of him. The same man who'd taught me to throw a baseball and change a tire and measure twice cut once. When we pulled apart, his eyes were wet and so were mine. Mom was there suddenly, pushing past Dad to grab me, her small frame shaking as she held on. "I'm sorry," she kept saying. "I'm so sorry, Marcus. I should have listened better. I should have asked more questions. I should have believed in you." I held her and let her cry and told her it was okay, even though part of me wanted to ask why it had taken a helicopter to make them see me. But that wasn't fair, I knew that. They'd raised me the best they could, with the understanding they had. The fact that they'd misjudged my path didn't mean they hadn't loved me. It just meant they'd been wrong, and now they knew it, and that was something. When Mom finally pulled back, she cupped my face in her hands like she used to when I was small. "Tell me everything," she said. "I want to know all of it, every detail I missed. I want to understand what you built." I nodded, feeling that tightness in my chest finally completely release. "'Kay, Mom," I said. "I'll tell you everything." Derek was still standing by the grill, isolated now as the party slowly resumed around him. People were moving again, conversation starting back up, though I could tell everyone was still processing what they'd witnessed. Vanessa had her phone out again, but she was texting frantically, not recording. Probably messaging her friends about the insane drama at her father-in-law's birthday party. The pilot caught my eye again, and I walked over to him, leaving my parents to collect themselves. "How long can you stay?" I asked quietly. He checked his watch. "Got another hour before I need to head back. Fuel's fine, weather's clear." "You need me to take her up again?" I shook my head. "No, I think one entrance was enough. Just want to make sure we're not blocking anything important. He glanced around the yard and grinned. Son, you're the most important thing happening here today. Trust me on that. I thanked him and turned back to find James Richardson standing at the back gate. Clearly just arrived. He must have parked on the street and walked around. When he saw me, his face split into a wide grin and he jogged over. Bro, he said, slightly out of breath. I got your text and drove over as fast as I could. Did you really land the helicopter in the backyard? Did you see their faces? Tell me you saw their faces. I saw their faces, I confirmed, and we both started laughing. That giddy relief that comes after tension finally breaks. James had been there through all of it, the struggle years, the long nights, the moments when we'd wondered if we were crazy for thinking we could compete with the big firms. He'd believed in the vision when no one else had, when even I had doubts. Having him here now felt right, like closing a circle. Come on, I said, leading him toward where Mom and Dad were standing. There's some people I want you to properly meet. I'd introduced James at a company holiday party 2 years ago, but it had been brief, awkward. My family not quite knowing what to make of my business partner. Now I could introduce him as the co-founder of a multi-million-dollar company, as the person who'd helped me build something real. As we walked across the yard, I caught Derek watching us from his spot by the grill. Our eyes met and held for a long moment, and in his face I saw something I'd never seen before. Not anger now, not even jealousy, but something closer to fear. The realization that everything he believed about our relative positions in the world had just been inverted, and he didn't know how to process it. His successful corporate career with its steady paycheck and clear hierarchy suddenly looked small next to the entrepreneurial risk that had paid off in ways he couldn't have imagined. I could have gloated in that moment. Could have twisted the knife, made him feel as small as he'd made me feel countless times. But that strange calm was still there, and with it came a kind of clarity. This wasn't about making Derek hurt. It was about claiming my own space, my own success, my own story. His reaction was his problem to solve, not mine to manage. The afternoon sun was starting to angle lower, casting long shadows across the yard. The paper lantern swayed gently in the breeze. The pulled pork was probably getting cold, and somewhere someone had turned on music, maybe trying to restore some normalcy to the gathering. But nothing was normal anymore, not really. The helicopter sat in the center of it all like a monument to changed perspectives. Impossible to ignore, reshaping the landscape of family dynamics with its mere presence. I introduced James to my parents properly this time, watched them shake hands and start talking about the business with genuine curiosity. Mrs. Patterson made her way over, patting my cheek and telling me she'd always known I was going places. Bill, the insurance guy, wanted to know if we needed commercial liability coverage. Derek's banking colleagues drifted closer, asking questions about our tech stack and client base, treating me like a professional peer rather than Derek's struggling little brother. And through it all, I felt something settling inside me that I hadn't even realized was unsettled. For 4 years I'd been carrying the weight of their doubts, their dismissals, their low expectations. I told myself it didn't matter, that I was doing this for me, that their opinions were irrelevant. But standing here now, watching them see me clearly maybe for the first time, I understood that it had mattered more than I wanted to admit. Not their approval exactly, but their recognition. Their acknowledgement that I'd chosen a different path and made it work. The sun caught the helicopter's windscreen and sent light scattering across the grass in rainbow prisms. In a few hours I'd fly it back to the hangar, return to my real life, to the contracts and clients and constantly growing demands of running a successful company. But right now, in this moment, I let myself just be here. In my parents' backyard, with a helicopter I'd bought with money I'd earned, surrounded by people who were finally asking the right questions. Derek stayed by the grill, and I let him. Whatever he needed to process, whatever adjustments he needed to make to his worldview, that was his journey now. Mine had led me here, to this impossible, improbable moment, and I was finally ready to own all of it. The sun had shifted lower by the time most of the guests started filtering out, offering congratulations to Dad and curious glances at the helicopter that still dominated the backyard. James had left an hour earlier, promising to handle the client call I'd rescheduled, shooting me a knowing grin as he walked out. Mrs. Patterson hugged me tight before she left, whispering that she'd always believed in me, which made my throat tight in a way I hadn't expected. Derek and Vanessa had disappeared into the house at some point, claiming Vanessa had a headache, though I suspected it had more to do with the uncomfortable questions Derek's colleagues kept asking about my business. I stayed to help clean up, stacking paper plates and folding tables while Dad worked the grill one last time, scraping down the grates with methodical precision. Mom moved between us with trash bags, her movements automatic from years of hosting these gatherings, but I caught her watching me when she thought I wasn't looking. There was something different in her gaze now. A mixture of pride and regret that made the space between us feel both closer and more complicated than it had that morning. The story of how I discovered Derek's financial troubles, the information that would eventually reshape everything, actually started 4 years and 3 months ago. Not at the barbecue, not even in the careful months of building my business, but on a Tuesday afternoon in late March when I'd still been working at the tech firm, 3 weeks before they'd announced the layoffs that would change my trajectory entirely. I'd stopped by Mom and Dad's house to drop off some photos I'd gotten printed from a family trip we'd taken to the mountains the previous fall. Dad had requested physical copies because he still didn't trust digital storage, convinced that everything on a computer could vanish in an instant. Mom had been out running errands and Dad was at a job site, so I'd let myself in with the spare key they kept hidden under the ceramic frog by the front steps. The photos were supposed to go on the kitchen counter with a note, a 5-minute errand at most. But as I'd walked through the living room, I'd noticed Derek's laptop sitting open on the coffee table, screen still lit. He must have stopped by earlier, probably for lunch with Mom like he did sometimes when his branch was slow. The screensaver hadn't kicked in yet, and I could see his email inbox displayed across the monitor. I should have just walked past. Should have gone straight to the kitchen, left the photos, locked the door behind me. But a subject line had caught my eye as I passed. Something about final notice and account status. My steps had slowed without conscious decision, my brain processing the words even as I told myself to keep moving. I'd stood there for maybe 10 seconds, arguing with myself about privacy and boundaries, before my curiosity won out. Just a glance, I told myself, just to make sure everything was okay. The email had been from Derek's mortgage company, and the preview text visible without opening it had made my stomach drop. This is your final notice before we begin foreclosure proceedings. Your account is currently 127 days past due with a balance of $47,862. I'd stared at those numbers, rereading them 3 times to make sure I understood correctly. Derek, who drove a BMW and took Vanessa to expensive restaurants and had just bought that massive house, was 4 months behind on his mortgage. I'd looked away from the laptop, guilt flooding through me for snooping. But the information had lodged itself in my brain like a splinter, uncomfortable and impossible to ignore. I'd delivered the photos to the kitchen, written my note to Mom, locked up and left. But driving back to my apartment, I couldn't stop thinking about what I'd seen. Derek had always been so careful about his image, so meticulous about presenting success. The idea that behind the curtain he was drowning didn't fit with everything I knew about him. Over the next few weeks, I tried to forget about it. Told myself it wasn't my business, that maybe I'd misread the email or misunderstood the situation. But then the layoff happened and suddenly I was the one scrambling, the one trying to figure out how to stay afloat. I'd gone to a family dinner 2 weeks after losing my job. Derek holding court as usual about a major deal he'd closed at the bank. Vanessa showing off a new designer handbag. And I'd sat there eating Mom's pot roast, knowing that while they looked successful, while they projected stability and achievement, they were actually teetering on the edge of financial collapse. It should have made me feel better about my own situation somehow, this knowledge that Derek wasn't as put together as he pretended. But instead it had made me feel hollow. Because if Derek with his corporate job and his careful planning could still end up buried in debt, what chance did I have trying to build something from nothing? The information had sat in the back of my mind like a weight, rarely thought about directly but always there, coloring my perception of family gatherings and Derek's advice. When I'd started the business, when those first brutal months had tested every assumption I'd had about my abilities and stamina, I'd sometimes think about Derek's mortgage troubles. Wonder if he'd resolved them, if he'd gotten back on track or if things had gotten worse. But I'd been too consumed with my own survival to investigate further. Every dollar I made went back into the business or toward keeping myself housed and fed. I worked 18-hour days and fell into bed exhausted. No energy left for worrying about my brother's finances. The second piece of information had come about a year later, once my business had stabilized enough that I could breathe occasionally. I'd been having lunch with Mom at the diner near her school, one of our monthly catch-ups that she'd insisted on maintaining even when I was barely scraping by. She'd been talking about Derek and Vanessa's plans to renovate their kitchen, some elaborate project involving custom cabinets and imported tile. The way she'd described it, carefully casual, had sent up a flag in my mind. Are they doing okay financially? I'd asked, trying to keep my tone neutral. With the house and everything? Mom had smiled, that tight smile she got when she was worried but trying not to show it. Oh, you know your brother, she'd said. He's got everything under control. Always so responsible with money. But then she'd added, almost as an afterthought, though I do wish they'd slow down a bit with the spending. Sometimes I think Vanessa doesn't quite understand that Derek's salary, while good, isn't unlimited. I'd filed that away too, another data point in a pattern I was starting to recognize. Over the next year, as my business grew and I started pulling in real revenue, I'd paid more attention at family gatherings. Noticed how Derek's stories about work had shifted subtly, less about big wins and more about challenges he was navigating. Watched how Vanessa's social media posts showcased an increasingly lavish lifestyle, designer everything, expensive vacations, the kind of consumption that didn't match a mid-level banking salary, even a generous one. The third piece had been more concrete, and it had come through an unexpected source. One of my early clients had been a regional credit union, brought on to upgrade their security systems after a minor data breach. The IT director there, Marcus Chen, had become something of a friend, someone I could grab beers with and talk shop. About 18 months into running my business, during one of those after-work sessions, Marcus had mentioned he was dealing with a difficult situation involving an employee's brother, who worked at a competing bank. The guy's got some kind of gambling problem, Marcus had said, nursing his beer. Comes in every couple months trying to get loans, always with some story about an investment opportunity or a short-term cash flow issue. We've turned him down 3 times now, but he keeps trying. I feel bad for his family. These things have a way of blowing up spectacularly. Something in my chest had tightened and I'd asked, carefully casual, what bank the guy worked for. When Marcus had named Derek's bank, when he'd mentioned the guy was in commercial lending, the pieces had started clicking together in a way I hadn't wanted to acknowledge. I'd changed the subject, made some joke about problem customers, let the conversation drift to safer topics. But afterward, I'd gone home and started thinking about all those little observations, all those small inconsistencies in Derek's carefully maintained facade. The mortgage troubles I glimpsed years ago, Mom's concerned comments about spending, the shift in how Derek talked about work, and now this suggestion of gambling or at minimum risky financial behavior. Individually, they were just fragments. Together, they suggested my brother was in serious trouble. I told myself it still wasn't my business. That Derek was an adult who made his own choices and would face his own consequences. I had enough to worry about with my own company, which was growing faster than I'd anticipated and demanding every ounce of focus I could muster. James and I were in the process of hiring our first full-time developer. We just landed the hospital network contract that would triple our revenue. I didn't have bandwidth to worry about Derek's problems, especially when he'd never shown any interest in mine. But the information had stayed lodged in my awareness, impossible to fully ignore. At Thanksgiving that year, I'd watched Derek more carefully. Noticed how his smile didn't quite reach his eyes when he talked about the promotion he was supposedly in line for. Saw how Vanessa kept checking her phone during dinner. Her expression pinched with stress she tried to hide behind filters and forced cheerfulness. Dad had asked Derek about retirement planning and Derek had deflected with a joke, changing the subject so smoothly that I don't think anyone else noticed the evasion. The fourth piece, the one that really crystallized everything, had come about 6 months before Dad's birthday barbecue. I'd been at the DMV renewing my license, standing in one of those endless lines that make you question all your life choices. Derek had walked in, not seeing me in the crowd, and gotten in the queue for vehicle registration. I'd watched him from 3 lanes over, noticed the tension in his shoulders, the way he kept checking his phone with increasing agitation. When he'd finally reached the counter, I'd been close enough to overhear parts of his conversation with the clerk. Something about late fees on his registration, a payment that hadn't gone through, could he put it on a credit card instead? The clerk had tried the card. It had been declined. Derek had pulled out another one, his face flushing red. That one had worked, but I'd seen the clerk's expression, professional but slightly pitying, And I'd known she'd seen this scenario play out countless times before. Derek had left without noticing me, and I'd stood there processing what I'd witnessed. A declined credit card wasn't necessarily damning, could happen to anyone for a dozen innocent reasons. But combined with everything else I knew, everything I'd observed and overheard over the past 4 years, it painted a picture that was hard to ignore. My brother, the golden child, the one who'd always done everything right, who'd followed the approved path and checked all the boxes, was drowning in debt and desperately trying to keep anyone from noticing. I thought about confronting him, maybe offering help or at least offering to listen. But every time I'd considered it, I'd remembered the way he talked to me at family gatherings. The condescension, the dismissiveness, the way he'd positioned himself as the successful one offering wisdom to his struggling little brother. How could I bring up his financial troubles without it seeming like gloating or revenge? And more fundamentally, would he even listen? Or would he just get defensive, find a way to turn it around, make me the problem for noticing? So I'd stayed silent and focused on my own business, which was exploding in ways I'd barely imagined possible. We'd landed the financial services contract, hired 3 more people, moved into a real office space with a conference room and everything. James and I had started talking seriously about long-term strategy, about building something that could compete with the major consulting firms on specific verticals. The money was getting real, not just survival money but actual wealth accumulation. I'd paid off my student loans, built up my savings, started investing. And through it all, I'd watched Derek's carefully constructed facade develop more cracks. He'd missed Dad's birthday dinner the previous year, claiming a work emergency that Mom had seemed to accept at face value, but that I'd suspected was about avoiding questions he didn't want to answer. Vanessa's social media posts had become more sporadic, less polished, the comments she made at gatherings increasingly bitter about money and stress. Derek himself had grown quieter, less likely to dominate conversations, more likely to deflect questions about his life. The final piece, the one that made everything click into sharp focus, had come just 2 months before the barbecue. I'd been meeting with Rebecca Walsh, the attorney James and I had brought on to help structure our growing business properly. We'd been discussing liability protection and corporate formations, technical stuff that made my eyes glaze over, but that Rebecca insisted was crucial. At the end of our meeting, as I'd been gathering my papers to leave, she'd mentioned almost offhandedly that she'd recently handled a bankruptcy filing for a banking professional. Can't say who, obviously she'd added attorney-client privilege and all that. But it's a reminder that even people in financial services can get underwater fast if they're not careful. House too big, cars too expensive, trying to maintain a lifestyle their income can't actually support. She'd shaken her head sadly. The worst part is they usually wait too long to get help. Pride, you know. They're supposed to be the experts, supposed to have it all figured out. Admitting they're struggling feels like admitting they failed at the one thing they're supposed to be good at. I'd driven back to the office in a daze, her words echoing in my head. Could Derek have filed for bankruptcy? Was that why he'd been so absent lately, so defensive? Or was he still in that danger zone, circling the drain but not quite ready to admit defeat? I'd wanted to know but hadn't known how to find out without violating privacy or trust in ways that couldn't be undone. That night, I'd lain awake thinking about the strange parallel paths Derek and I had been on. 4 years ago, we'd both been in our 30s, both supposedly building careers and futures. He'd had the corporate job, the wife, the house, the trappings of success that everyone recognized and approved of. I'd had nothing but a severance check and a risky idea that most people thought was naive at best. Fast forward to now, and I was sitting on a multi-million-dollar government contract with more business than I could handle. And Derek, unless I was completely misreading the signs, was struggling to keep his head above water. There was no satisfaction in it, no sense of vindication or justice. Just a hollow awareness that the paths we choose and the facades we maintain don't always reflect the reality underneath. Derek had played it safe, followed the rules, done everything he was supposed to do. And somehow it hadn't been enough, or he'd made mistakes along the way that had compounded into crisis. Meanwhile, I'd taken the risk everyone had warned against, the entrepreneurial leap that was supposed to lead to failure, and it had worked out beyond my wildest projections. The week before Dad's barbecue, I'd made a decision, not to confront Derek or expose his troubles, but to simply show up and be undeniably, unavoidably successful. Let the helicopter speak for itself. Let the evidence of my achievements stand without apology or explanation. Not as revenge, though I'd be lying if I said there wasn't some satisfaction in imagining Derek's face when I landed, but more as a statement of truth. This is what I built. This is what I accomplished. This is who I am regardless of what you thought I'd become. I'd called the aviation company and arranged for the purchase of the helicopter, something I'd been considering for months but had hesitated on because it felt excessive. But in that moment, planning for the barbecue, it had felt exactly right. Not practical, not sensible, but symbolically perfect. A literal rising above. A physical manifestation of reaching heights they told me were impossible. The expense had made James laugh in disbelief when I'd told him, but he'd understood immediately what I was doing and why. Now, standing in the backyard as evening approached, helping Dad fold the last of the chairs while the helicopter cast long shadows across damaged grass, I thought about all those fragments of information I'd collected over 4 years. All those glimpses into Derek's reality that he'd tried so hard to hide. I'd never intended to use them as weapons, never planned to expose him or humiliate him. But knowing the truth had given me a kind of armor, a protection against his judgments and dismissals. When he'd implied I was irresponsible for not following a traditional career path, I'd known he was barely holding on to his own traditional career. When he'd suggested I needed stability and security, I'd known his own stability was illusory. And when he'd stood by that grill today, offering his opinions on fiscal responsibility and long-term planning, I'd known with absolute certainty that I understood those concepts better than he ever had, because I'd built something real instead of just borrowing against an imagined future. Dad set down the last chair and looked at the helicopter, still sitting where I'd landed it hours ago. You really flew that here yourself, he said, and it wasn't quite a question. I nodded. Took lessons for 3 weeks straight, practiced until the instructor said I was ready, then got my license certified. It's not as hard as it looks once you understand the mechanics, but it requires complete focus. Can't let your mind wander even for a second up there. He was quiet for a moment, his weathered hands hanging at his sides. I built things my whole life, he said finally. Houses, developments, structures people live and work in. Always thought that was the only kind of building that mattered. The physical kind, the kind you can see and touch. I didn't understand that you were building too. Just building something different. The admission hung in the air between us and I felt that tightness in my chest again. It's okay, Dad. I didn't always know what I was building either. Some days I was just trying to survive until the next month. It wasn't until things really started working that I could see the shape of what I'd made. He nodded slowly, processing. Your mother's going to want to know everything. Every detail, every step. She feels terrible about not asking before. Tell her I'll come by this weekend, I said. I'll bring James, we'll walk you both through the whole story. Show you the office, introduce you to the team, explain what we actually do all day. I want you to understand it, not just know that it's successful. Dad's expression softened into something that might have been relief. I'd like that, son. I really would. Mom came out then, carrying a container of leftover pulled pork that she pressed into my hands despite my protests. Derek and Vanessa are staying the night, she said quietly. I think they need some time to process everything. Her eyes searched mine, looking for I wasn't sure what. Maybe permission, maybe reassurance that I wasn't going to push the confrontation further. I'm not trying to make things hard for them, I said, meaning it. This wasn't about Derek, it was about me. About being seen clearly, about claiming my own achievements. What he does with that is up to him. She squeezed my arm, her teacher's instinct for reading between lines probably picking up on more than I'd said. You're a good man, Marcus. Better than I gave you credit for, and that's my failure, not yours. The words settled something in me I hadn't known needed settling. I hugged her again, feeling her small frame solid and real in my arms. I'll see you this weekend, Mom. We'll talk about everything then. The pilot had been patient, sitting in the helicopter and checking his instruments, giving our family time to work through the emotional aftermath of my dramatic arrival. Now he caught my eye and pointed at his watch, a gentle reminder that we needed to head back before the light failed completely. I nodded, shook Dad's hand one more time, kissed Mom's cheek, then walked toward the helicopter. The door opened smoothly and I climbed into the right seat, strapping in with practiced movements that still felt surreal. As we lifted off, the backyard dropping away beneath us, I looked down at Mom and Dad standing together in the growing dusk, their faces upturned to watch. The neighborhood spread out in all directions, familiar streets and houses I'd known my whole life. all of it getting smaller as we climbed. The sun was setting properly now, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, Charlotte's skyline visible in the distance. The pilot's voice came through my headset. "Quite an entrance you made today." I laughed, feeling the adrenaline and emotion of the past few hours finally starting to drain away. "Yeah," I said. "It was definitely that." He was quiet for a moment, then added, "For what it's worth, family stuff is always complicated. But standing up for yourself, showing them who you really are, that takes courage. Most people just keep their heads down and accept whatever role their family assigns them." I thought about Derek, still in the house, probably lying in his childhood bedroom staring at the ceiling trying to make sense of how his little brother had just shattered his worldview. I thought about the bankruptcy Rebecca had mentioned, wondering if Derek had filed or was still in that limbo of denial. And I thought about all those fragments of information I'd gathered over the years, each one a small window into a reality he tried to hide. Maybe someday we'd talk about it, really talk brother to brother without the performance and positioning. Maybe he'd admit he was struggling and I could help, not with money necessarily but with perspective, with the understanding that success comes in different forms and timelines. Or maybe we'd just continue existing in parallel, maintaining polite distance at family gatherings, each dealing with our own lives in our own ways. The helicopter banked slightly, turning toward the airport, and I let myself sink into the moment. The vibration of the rotors, the darkening sky, the city lights beginning to sparkle below. For years of work, of struggle, of quiet determination had led to this moment. Not just the helicopter, not just the contracts or the money, but this feeling of finally fully being seen as who I actually was rather than who they'd assumed I'd be. Tomorrow I'd go back to the office, back to the endless demands of running a growing company. There would be client calls and contract negotiations, hiring decisions and technical problems that needed solving. James would want a full debrief on the barbecue, probably laugh himself sick at the mental image of Derek's face when I landed. Life would continue, complex and demanding and full of challenges I couldn't yet anticipate. But tonight, flying through the sunset back to the hangar, I let myself simply feel satisfied. The kind of deep, bone-level satisfaction that comes from proving something to yourself more than anyone else. I'd built something real from nothing. I'd turned rejection and dismissal into fuel. And I'd risen, literally and metaphorically, higher than anyone had thought possible. The radio crackled with tower communications and the pilot responded smoothly, beginning our descent toward the airport. Below us, Charlotte glowed in the gathering dark. A city full of people building their own dreams and fighting their own battles. Somewhere down there, Derek was wrestling with his own demons, his own choices and consequences. And I hoped, genuinely hoped, that he'd find his way through to the other side. But that was his journey now. Mine had brought me here, to this cockpit, this helicopter, this moment of absolute clarity about who I was and what I'd achieved. And as we touched down on the tarmac, smooth and controlled, I felt ready for whatever came next. The weekend visit to my parents' house came faster than I expected. Saturday morning arrived with unseasonable warmth, the kind of weather that made Charlotte feel more like a vacation destination than the place where I'd grown up. James met me at my loft at 9. Carrying 2 boxes of pastries from the French bakery downtown and wearing what he called his meet the parents outfit, which just meant jeans without holes and a button-down shirt instead of his usual graphic tees. "You ready for this?" he asked as we loaded everything into my car, and I realized I actually was. The nervous energy from the barbecue had settled into something calmer, a readiness to finally share the full story without editing or downplaying. Mom had apparently been preparing for days. When we arrived, the dining room table was already set with her good dishes, the one she only brought out for major holidays, and the smell of fresh coffee and cinnamon rolls filled the house. Dad was in the living room reading the newspaper, but he folded it immediately when we walked in, standing to shake James's hand with that firm grip he'd perfected over 40 years of construction work. "Your mother's been talking about this visit non-stop," he said, his voice carrying a warmth I hadn't heard directed at my work in years. "She even made me clean out the garage yesterday so she could show you the organizational system I built, like that has anything to do with computer security." James laughed easily, falling into conversation with Dad about building projects and structural engineering in a way that surprised me until I remembered he'd grown up helping his uncle renovate houses every summer. Mom swept in from the kitchen, immediately pulling me into a hug that lasted longer than usual, then turning to James with the same treatment. "I'm so glad you're here," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "I want to understand everything Marcus has built, and he tells me you've been there from the beginning." We settled around the dining room table with coffee and pastries, and for the first time in 4 years, I told them the complete story. Not the edited version I'd offered at family gatherings, not the vague references to contracts and clients, but the real narrative with all its struggles and victories intact. I started at the beginning with the layoff that had felt like the end of the world, and James jumped in with details I'd forgotten or minimized. How I'd worked 18-hour days for the first 6 months, how there'd been a week where I'd survived on ramen and black coffee because every dollar needed to go toward server costs, how I'd cold-called potential clients with a script I'd practiced in the mirror, trying to sound confident and established when I was actually terrified and completely unproven. Mom listened with her hand pressed to her mouth, her eyes shining with tears she kept blinking back. Dad's expression cycled through emotions I couldn't quite name, but he never interrupted, just nodded slowly as pieces fell into place. When I got to the part about the hospital contract, our first major breakthrough, James pulled out his phone and showed them the facility, explained the scope of what we'd built. It wasn't just about installing firewalls, he said, his enthusiasm making him talk faster. Marcus designed an entire security ecosystem from scratch, something that could scale with their growth and adapt to new threats. The big consulting firms wanted to charge them $500,000 and take a year. We did it for a third of that in 2 months and did it better. I walked them through each major milestone after that. The financial services firm that had given us credibility in a new sector. The manufacturing company whose breach we'd prevented, saving them millions in potential losses. The slow, steady accumulation of expertise and reputation that had positioned us perfectly when the government contracts started appearing. James handled the technical explanations when things got complicated, translating our work into terms that made sense to people outside the industry. Dad asked surprisingly sharp questions about scaling and capacity, his construction background giving him an intuitive grasp of project management that translated across industries. When I got to the part about the government contract, the one that had changed everything, I pulled out my laptop and showed them the sanitized version of the proposal we'd submitted. "Obviously I can't show you the classified details," I said, "but this gives you a sense of the scope. $12 million over 3 years to design and implement a comprehensive threat assessment and data protection system for an agency I can't name. We beat out firms with 100 times our resources because we could move faster and deliver exactly what they needed without the bureaucratic overhead." Mom's hand found Dad's on the table and they sat there holding hands like teenagers, staring at the numbers on the screen. "That's more money than we made in our entire careers combined," Dad said quietly. "And you're saying there's more work coming, more contracts like this?" James nodded enthusiastically. "This opened doors we didn't even know existed. We've got 3 more proposals in the pipeline right now, all government or government-adjacent work. The reputation we're building in this space, it's putting us in conversations with decision-makers at the highest levels." The morning stretched into afternoon as we talked, the conversation flowing in directions I hadn't anticipated. Dad wanted to know about our team, how we'd recruited people and what we looked for in candidates. Mom asked about work-life balance and whether I was taking care of myself. The eternal teacher's concern for well-being cutting across professional success. James told stories I'd forgotten, moments when things had looked impossible and I'd somehow found solutions. His perspective on my work more generous than my own self-assessment would have been. At some point, Mom brought out photo albums, insisting on showing James pictures of me as a kid. There was something healing about sitting there watching her flip through pages, pointing out school plays and science fairs and soccer games, all the normal childhood moments that had led somehow to this unexpected present. Dad disappeared into his office and came back with blueprints from houses he'd built, showing James his own version of creation and problem solving, the pride in his work evident in how carefully he preserved these documents. It was almost 3 in the afternoon when the front door opened and Derek walked in, Vanessa trailing behind him. They both stopped short seeing James and me at the dining room table surrounded by laptops and photo albums, and the remnants of our extended conversation. The air in the room shifted immediately, that comfortable warmth replaced by tension that made my shoulders tighten. Derek's face was carefully neutral, but I could see the effort it took to maintain that expression. His eyes flicked over the scene, taking in how at ease we all were. How Mom and Dad were leaning in toward James as he explained something on his phone screen. "We just came by to pick up some things we left last night," Derek said, his voice strained. "Didn't mean to interrupt." Mom stood immediately, her hospitality instincts overriding the awkwardness. "You're not interrupting, honey. Come sit down, have some coffee. Marcus and James are just telling us about the business." Derek's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, but Vanessa's hand on his arm stopped whatever response he'd been about to make. "We really should get going," Vanessa said, her voice artificially bright. "Lots to do today." "But Dad surprised me then," his voice carrying a note of authority that didn't allow for argument. "Sit down, Derek. Both of you. I think you should hear this too." It was the tone that had commanded construction crews for decades, the voice that expected compliance without question. Derek hesitated, his pride visibly warring with his ingrained response to paternal authority, then slowly moved to the table. Vanessa followed, both of them settling into chairs with the rigid posture of people preparing for an unpleasant experience. The conversation resumed, but differently now, more careful, with James and I editing our enthusiasm to account for Derek's presence. Mom kept trying to draw Derek into the discussion, asking if he'd known about certain milestones or contracts, but his responses were clipped and minimal. Vanessa stayed silent, her phone in her lap, periodically checking it with increasingly obvious discomfort. I could feel the weight of everything unspoken pressing down on the room, all those fragments of information I'd collected over the years about Derek's financial troubles, hovering just beneath the surface of polite conversation. James, bless him, tried to bridge the gap by asking Derek about his work at the bank. "The mortgage industry must be interesting right now with all the rate changes," he said, his tone genuinely curious. Derek's response was defensive before he even finished the sentence. "It's fine. Complicated. Lots of regulations and compliance issues that people outside the industry don't really understand." There was an edge to his words that suggested the conversation was crossing into territory he didn't want to explore. Dad either didn't notice the tension or chose to push through it. "Derek's been with the bank for almost 15 years now," he said, obvious pride in his voice, though it sounded a bit forced compared to how he'd been talking about my business earlier. "Working his way up the ladder, doing things the right way." There was something in that phrase, "doing things the right way," that felt like it was meant to draw a contrast with my unconventional path. But the comparison didn't land the way it might have a week ago, not with the evidence of my success spread across the table. I watched Derek process the shift, saw him recognize that the family dynamic had fundamentally changed. He wasn't the golden child anymore, the one whose career path was held up as the model. That role had been quietly transferred without anyone explicitly acknowledging it, the way family hierarchies often shift, through accumulation of small moments rather than dramatic declarations. His face cycled through emotions, settling into something that looked like exhaustion more than anger. Vanessa broke the increasingly uncomfortable silence by standing abruptly. "We really do need to go," she said, and this time her voice carried genuine urgency. Derek stood with her, relief visible in his posture. Mom tried to convince them to stay for dinner, already planning what she'd make, but Vanessa demurred with excuses about prior commitments and early mornings. Derek made it to the door before turning back, his eyes finding mine across the room. "The helicopter was a nice touch," he said, and I couldn't tell if it was meant as acknowledgement or accusation. Really drove the point home. I held his gaze, keeping my voice level. "It wasn't about making a point, Derek. It was about showing up as who I actually am instead of who everyone assumed I'd be." Something flickered in his expression, too quick to name. "Yeah, well," he said. "Congratulations on your success. Hope it lasts." The door closed behind them and the tension drained from the room like air from a punctured tire. Mom sank back into her chair, looking troubled. "He's struggling," she said quietly. "Has been for a while now. I wish he'd talk to us about it instead of pretending everything's fine." Dad made a non-committal sound, his builder's practicality warring with parental concern. "Man's got to handle his own problems. Can't force help on someone who doesn't want it." James caught my eye across the table, a silent question about whether I wanted to say anything about what I knew. I gave a tiny shake of my head. This wasn't the moment, not with the wound so fresh from the barbecue. If Derek wanted help, he'd have to ask for it, and I suspected his pride wouldn't allow that anytime soon. Instead, I steered the conversation back to safer ground, showing Mom pictures of our office space and introducing the idea of bringing them by sometime for a proper tour. The rest of the afternoon passed more easily, the shadow of Derek's visit fading as we returned to talking about the business and the future. Dad wanted to know about my 5-year plan, what I saw as the next phase of growth. Mom asked about whether I was thinking about settling down, maybe finding someone to share this success with, and I'd laughed and told her I was working on it, though work had consumed so much bandwidth that dating had fallen to the bottom of my priority list. James had jumped in with stories about failed attempts to set me up with friends of friends, making everyone laugh and lightening the mood further. As evening approached and James and I prepared to leave, Mom pulled me aside in the kitchen while Dad showed James something in the garage. "I'm proud of you," she said again, her hands gripping my arms. "But I'm also sorry it took something as dramatic as a helicopter for me to really see what you've been building. I should have asked more questions, should have been more curious about your work. Should have believed in you the way you needed me to." The apology hit harder than I'd expected, forcing me to confront feelings I'd pushed down for years. "It wasn't that I didn't want your support, Mom," I said carefully. "It was that I couldn't keep explaining myself to people who'd already decided I was making a mistake. At some point I had to just put my head down and prove it to myself, regardless of what anyone else thought." She nodded, tears spilling over despite her efforts to contain them. "I know, and that's what makes me saddest. That you felt like you had to do it. Alone when you should have had your family cheering you on the whole way." We stood in her kitchen, in the house where I'd grown up, and something old and painful finally released its grip on my chest. "I didn't do it completely alone," I said. "James believed in me when no one else did. Some of my early clients took chances on me that they didn't have to take. And in a weird way, the doubt pushed me harder, made me more determined to succeed because failure would have confirmed everything they believed about my choices." Mom hugged me again, fierce and long, then pulled back to look at my face. "You're going to do great things, Marcus, even greater than what you've already done. I can see it now, that drive and vision you have. And I'm going to be paying attention this time, really paying attention, asking the questions I should have been asking all along." I smiled, feeling lighter than I had in years. "I'd like that, Mom. I really would." James and I left as the sun was setting, the same golden hour light that had illuminated my helicopter landing a week ago. In the car, he was quiet for a while, just letting the radio fill the space. Finally he said, "Your family's complicated, man. They love you, that's obvious, but they really didn't get it until they couldn't ignore it anymore." I nodded, watching Charlotte streets pass by the window. "Yeah, but they're trying now. That's more than some people get." He was silent another moment, then added, "Derek, though. That guy's hurting. I saw it in how he held himself, how he couldn't quite look at you. Whatever's going on with him, it's bad." "I know," I said quietly. "I've known for a while actually. Bits and pieces I picked up over the years. He's in financial trouble, maybe serious trouble, and he can't admit it because his whole identity is wrapped up in being the successful, responsible one." James whistled low. "So the helicopter landing wasn't just about showing your parents what you'd built. It was about making Derek face reality too." I thought about that, about my motivations and what I'd really been trying to accomplish. Maybe partly, I admitted. But more than that, it was about refusing to be invisible anymore. Refusing to downplay my achievements or apologize for taking a different path. Derek's issues are his to solve. I can't fix them, and honestly I don't think he'd let me try. We drove in companionable silence for a while, each processing the day in our own way. As we approached downtown, James said, "So what happens now? You've made your point, proved everyone wrong, landed the helicopter both literally and metaphorically. What's the next chapter?" I thought about the proposals in our pipeline, the hiring we needed to do, the infrastructure we'd have to build to handle the scale of work coming our way. Thought about the conversations I probably need to have with Derek eventually, the family dynamics that would keep shifting and settling into new patterns. "Now we build," I said simply. "We deliver on these contracts, we hire great people, we establish ourselves as the go-to firm for this kind of work. We turn this success into something sustainable and lasting instead of just a moment." And maybe, I paused, considering, maybe I figure out how to have a life outside work now that I don't have to spend every waking hour proving myself. James grinned. "Does that mean you'll actually come to the happy hours I keep inviting you to? Meet some people, maybe even go on a date that doesn't get canceled because of a client emergency?" I laughed. "Let's not get crazy. But yeah, maybe. I can afford to breathe a little now, delegate more, trust the team we've built. Success isn't just about working yourself to death. It's about building something that functions without you having to be involved in every single decision." He pulled up to my building and we sat there for a moment, the engine idling. "Thanks for today," I said. for backing me up with my parents, for helping them understand, for being there from the beginning when this was just a desperate idea and a stack of unpaid bills. James reached over and gripped my shoulder. "Brother," he said, and his voice was serious now. "You did this. I helped, sure, but you're the one who had the vision and the balls to chase it when everyone was telling you to play it safe. Don't minimize that." I nodded, feeling the weight of 4 years settle into something I could carry with pride instead of defensiveness. We said goodbye and I headed up to my loft, the space that had been my command center through the hardest period of building the business. It looked different now somehow, less like a fortress I was hiding in and more like a launching pad I was preparing to leave. Not physically necessarily, though I could afford something bigger now if I wanted. But psychologically, emotionally, I was ready to move beyond survival mode into something more expansive. My phone buzzed with a text from Mom. "Thank you for today. For sharing your story, for bringing James, for helping us understand. We're so proud of you, honey. More than we can say." There was a second text right after. "Derek called. He's going through something difficult. When he's ready to talk, I hope you'll listen. Not fix, just listen. He might need that more than he knows." I stared at the message, thinking about the fragments I'd collected over 4 years, the pattern they revealed about my brother's struggles. Thought about the careful facade he maintained and how exhausting it must be to keep pretending everything was fine when it clearly wasn't. I didn't know if Derek would ever reach out, if his pride would allow him to be vulnerable with the little brother he'd spent so long positioning himself above. But if he did, I'd listen. Not with judgment or vindication, but with the understanding that success and struggle weren't mutually exclusive, that the path that looks safe can sometimes be the riskiest of all. I pulled up my email and started drafting a message to the team about Monday's priorities, then stopped. For once, work could wait. Instead, I poured a glass of whiskey, good stuff I'd bought to celebrate the government contract but hadn't opened yet, and walked out onto my balcony. The city spread out below, lights beginning to twinkle as night settled in. Somewhere out there, Derek was wrestling with his demons. Mom and Dad were probably talking about the day, processing everything they'd learned. James was likely already texting his girlfriend about the family drama he'd witnessed. And I was here, standing on a balcony I'd earned through risk and work and determination, drinking whiskey that celebrated a success I'd built from nothing. The helicopter was at the hangar, ready for whenever I wanted to fly again. The business was strong and growing stronger. My family finally understood what I'd been working toward all these years. It wasn't the ending, wasn't some final victory that solved everything. Derek's troubles were still there. Family dynamics would remain complicated. And the business would throw new challenges at me that I couldn't yet anticipate. But it was a moment of arrival nonetheless. A place I'd been climbing toward without always knowing what the summit would look like. And standing here now, tasting expensive whiskey and watching the city lights, I let myself feel satisfied with how far I'd come and excited about how much further I could go. The pattern I'd recognized in Derek's life, that careful construction of an image that didn't match reality, had taught me something valuable. That authentic success, the kind that could withstand scrutiny, came from building something real rather than maintaining appearances. I built something real. In the face of doubt and dismissal, through struggle and setbacks, I'd constructed a company that mattered, that solved problems and employed talented people, and generated wealth that could ripple outward in meaningful ways. The helicopter had been symbolic, but the business beneath it was substance. And that substance would endure long after the drama of the barbecue landing faded into family legend. My phone buzzed again, this time a text from Rebecca Walsh. "Heard through the grapevine about your weekend family visit. Hope it went well. Also, we should discuss the new contract proposals. These could position us for something really significant. Talk Monday?" I replied with a thumbs up, already thinking about the week ahead, the decisions waiting, the momentum we'd need to maintain. But for tonight, I let it wait. Let myself just be Marcus Bennett on a Saturday night, successful beyond what anyone had predicted, complicated by family dynamics that would probably never fully resolve, and fundamentally satisfied with the choices I'd made even when they'd seemed impossible. The city hummed with life below, full of other people chasing their own versions of this feeling, building their own versions of success against whatever odds they faced. I raised my glass in a silent toast to all of them, to the risk-takers and dreamers and stubbornly determined believers who refused to accept the limitations others placed on them. Then I finished the whiskey, feeling it warm all the way down, and smiled at the thought of Monday morning and everything still to come. The Monday morning light filtered through the floor-to-ceiling windows of our office, casting geometric shadows across the conference table where James and I sat reviewing the week's priorities. The space still felt new to me, sometimes despite having moved in 8 months ago. Still surprising that we occupied an entire floor in one of Charlotte's newer commercial buildings with views that stretched to the horizon. Rebecca Walsh arrived precisely at 9, carrying her leather portfolio, and the kind of energy that suggested important news. She settled into her chair with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd learned to make every minute count, pulling out 3 separate folders and arranging them on the table with deliberate care. "These are the contract proposals I mentioned over the weekend," she said, tapping the first folder. 2 government agencies and 1 major defense contractor, all looking for the same basic service suite we've been building expertise in. The timelines are aggressive, the budgets are substantial, and the reputation benefits could be transformative. But here's the thing, and she paused for emphasis. If we take all 3, we're committing to scaling up faster than we'd planned. We'd need to double our staff within 6 months, expand our infrastructure significantly, and maintain the quality standards that got us these opportunities in the first place. James leaned forward, his analytical mind already working through the logistics. "What's the total contract value we're talking about?" Rebecca flipped open the first folder and pointed to a number that made even my battle-tested composure falter. "Combined, approximately $32 million over the next 4 years. That's assuming we meet all benchmarks and exercise the extension options built into 2 of the contracts. It would make us one of the top regional cybersecurity firms in the Southeast, possibly position us for national expansion if we handle it correctly." The number sat heavy in the air, transforming the Monday morning meeting into something that felt more consequential. This wasn't incremental growth anymore. Wasn't the steady climb we'd been managing for the past 4 years. This was acceleration into a completely different tier of business, the kind that required not just technical expertise but organizational maturity we'd have to build on the fly. I felt that familiar tightness in my chest, the one that always accompanied major decisions, equal parts excitement and terror at the magnitude of what we were considering. "What's our capacity look like if we commit to all 3, I asked, already knowing the answer would be uncomfortable. James pulled up a spreadsheet on his laptop, one he'd apparently been working on over the weekend in anticipation of this conversation. "Currently, we're running at about 85% capacity with our existing contracts and team. These 3 would push us to approximately 240% of current capacity. So we'd need to hire aggressively, which means recruitment costs, training time, potential quality control issues as new people come up to speed. Plus infrastructure," he continued, warming to his subject. "We'd need more secure server space, possibly a second office location to handle the classified work, upgraded communication systems, the works." Rebecca nodded, clearly having anticipated this analysis. "Which is why I'm recommending we take 2 of the 3, not all 3. Specifically, the 2 government contracts. They're cleaner, better aligned with our existing expertise, and the defense contractor one has some intellectual property clauses that make me nervous about long-term complications. We'd still be looking at roughly $23 million, still transformative growth, but more manageable from an operational standpoint." I stood and walked to the window, looking out over Charlotte's skyline while my brain processed the implications. 4 years ago I'd been sitting in a cramped apartment wondering if I'd made a catastrophic mistake leaving corporate employment. 2 years ago we'd been celebrating landing our first $1 million contract, like it was the pinnacle of achievement. Now we were casually discussing turning down $9 million because it might be too much too fast. The trajectory felt surreal, like watching someone else's life unfold, rather than living my own. "What's the timeline for decision?" I asked without turning around. Rebecca consulted her notes. "Defense contractor wants an answer by end of week. The 2 government contracts have slightly longer windows, about 3 weeks, but earlier commitment would give us advantage in the selection process. So realistically, we need to decide this week which direction we're going." James's voice came from behind me, thoughtful and measured. "There's another consideration here beyond just capacity and logistics. Our reputation is built on delivering exceptional work, on being the firm that does what we promise better and faster than expected. If we overextend and start missing deadlines or delivering subpar work, that reputation evaporates fast. In this industry, word spreads quickly about who can handle pressure and who cracks under it. He was right, and I knew it. The helicopter landing at the barbecue had been symbolic of success already achieved, but these contracts represented the future, the sustainability of everything we'd built. Taking on too much, driven by ambition or ego or the desire to prove we could, might be the very thing that undermined the foundation we'd worked so hard to establish. But turning down work, especially work this lucrative and prestigious, went against every survival instinct I'd developed during those brutal early years when any contract felt like salvation. I turned back to face them, leaning against the window frame. Walk me through what taking the 2 government contracts looks like operationally. Specific timeline for hiring, infrastructure upgrades, everything. Rebecca and James exchanged glances, then James pulled up another document, clearly something they'd collaborated on over the weekend in preparation for this exact request. His presentation was thorough, breaking down each phase of scaling up with the kind of detail that revealed just how seriously they'd been considering this possibility. We'd need to hire 12 people within the first 3 months, he explained, a mix of senior analysts, developers, and project managers. That's assuming we can find qualified candidates, which in this market isn't guaranteed. We'd spend weeks just interviewing and vetting, then another month getting people cleared for the classified work. So realistically, we're looking at 4 to 5 months before new hires are fully productive, which means our existing team carries extra load during that transition. Rebecca jumped in with the financial projections, showing how the revenue from the contracts would offset the hiring and infrastructure costs, but with a lag that required careful cash flow management. We'd need to draw on our line of credit for the first 6 months, she said, which I'm comfortable with given the contract guarantees. But it does mean operating with less cushion than we've been accustomed to. Higher risk, higher reward, the classic entrepreneurial equation. The conversation continued for another hour, drilling into details and contingencies, exploring best-case and worst-case scenarios with the kind of thoroughness that major decisions demanded. By the time we finished, my head was spinning with numbers and timelines and risk assessments, but a clarity was emerging from the complexity. We'd take the 2 government contracts and pass on the defense contractor work. It was aggressive growth but manageable, transformative but not reckless, the kind of calculated risk that had defined our success so far. Rebecca left to begin the formal response process, and James and I sat in the sudden quiet of the conference room. You know what's wild, he said after a moment. 4 years ago we were working out of your apartment wondering if we could make rent. Now we're turning down $9 million because we're being strategic about growth. That's not just success, man, that's maturity. I laughed, feeling the weight of the decision settling into something I could carry. Yeah, but it still feels crazy. Part of me wants to grab everything, say yes to all of it just because we can. James nodded, understanding. That's the scarcity mindset talking, the survival brain that remembers being broke and terrified. But we're not there anymore. We've got enough success and stability to make choices based on what's smart rather than what's available. That's a privilege most entrepreneurs never reach. His words resonated with something I'd been feeling since the barbecue. This sense of having crossed some invisible threshold into a different category of existence. Not just financially, though that was part of it, but psychologically, emotionally, in how I move through the world. The rest of Monday unfolded in a cascade of meetings and decisions, the normal rhythm of running a growing company. But underneath the routine tasks, I could feel the weight of what we'd committed to, the growth curve we'd have to navigate over the coming months. By Tuesday afternoon, Rebecca had formalized our acceptance of the 2 government contracts, setting in motion a process that would reshape the company yet again. Wednesday brought the first wave of recruitment needs, James and I spending hours defining the roles we needed to fill and the qualities we'd look for in candidates. Thursday afternoon, my phone rang with a number I didn't recognize, a local Charlotte area code but not one in my contacts. I almost let it go to voicemail, caught up in reviewing a technical proposal, but something made me answer. The voice on the other end was hesitant, rougher than I remembered it. Marcus, it's Derek. You got a minute to talk? The request caught me so off guard that I nearly dropped the phone, my brain scrambling to shift gears from contract specifications to family dynamics in the span of a heartbeat. Yeah, I said, standing and moving to my office for privacy, closing the door behind me. Yeah, I've got time. What's up? The silence that followed stretched long enough that I wondered if the connection had dropped. Then Derek's voice came back, quieter now, stripped of the bravado that usually characterized his communication. I need to talk to someone who might understand. About business stuff. Financial stuff. And I figured he paused again, struggling. I figured you might be the right person to ask. I sat down heavily in my desk chair, processing the magnitude of what those words represented. Derek asking me for help, admitting implicitly that he was struggling, reaching across the divide that had separated us for so long. Okay, I said carefully, keeping my voice neutral and non-judgmental. I'm listening. What's going on? What followed was a confession that must have cost him everything pride could spend. The mortgage troubles had never really been resolved, just postponed through refinancing that had bought time but increased overall debt. The lifestyle he and Vanessa had been maintaining wasn't supported by his salary, hadn't been for years, sustained instead by credit cards and loans and the kind of financial juggling that eventually runs out of room to maneuver. He'd made some investment decisions that had seemed smart at the time but had gone south spectacularly, losses he'd hidden from Vanessa while trying to recover them through increasingly desperate moves. The promotion he'd been chasing, the one that was supposed to solve everything, had gone to someone else. His performance reviews had been declining because the stress was affecting his work. And now he was facing a choice between bankruptcy or trying to negotiate settlements with creditors, while his marriage strained under the weight of secrets he'd been keeping. The words came in bursts, sometimes rushed and defensive, sometimes halting with shame, but they kept coming like a dam had finally broken. I listened without interrupting, letting him exhaust the story that had clearly been building pressure for years. When he finally stopped, breathing hard like he'd run a marathon, I took a moment before responding. The old impulse was there, the temptation to say something cutting about how he should have asked for help sooner, or how his condescending advice over the years looked different in this context. But that strange calm that had settled over me at the barbecue was still there, and with it came unexpected compassion. That's a lot to be carrying, Derek, I said finally. No wonder you've seemed stressed at family gatherings. I appreciate you trusting me with this. He made a sound that might have been a laugh or a sob. I didn't want to tell you, he admitted. After the helicopter thing, after seeing how successful you've become doing everything I told you not to do, it felt like the ultimate humiliation. But Mom said you might listen without judging, and I'm desperate enough to try anything at this point. I'm not going to judge you, I said, meaning it. Different people make different choices and sometimes those choices don't work out the way we hoped. That doesn't make you a failure, Derek, just human. What I will do is give you some names, professionals who can help sort through this stuff properly. A financial advisor I know who specializes in debt restructuring, and a therapist who works with people dealing with financial stress and relationship issues. This is too complex for me to handle, but these people can actually help if you're willing to work with them. The relief in his voice was palpable. You do that? Just give me the contacts without making me grovel, or throwing my past behavior in my face. I thought about all the years of condescension, all the dismissive comments and unsolicited advice, all the ways Derek had made me feel small for not following his approved path. And I realized that holding on to that resentment would hurt me more than him, would poison whatever chance we had at rebuilding some kind of functional relationship. We're brothers, I said simply. That matters more than our history of being shitty to each other. We talked for another 30 minutes, and I shared some of my own struggles from the early years, moments when the business had teetered on the edge of failure, decisions that had kept me awake at night wondering if I'd made catastrophic mistakes. Not to compare our situations or minimize his struggles, but to remind him that everyone faces challenges, that the image people project rarely matches the complexity underneath. By the time we hung up, something had shifted between us. Not resolution exactly, but the beginning of honesty that might eventually lead there. Friday brought James into my office with curious eyes, clearly having noticed my distracted energy. You okay, boss? He asked, settling into the chair across from my desk. You've been somewhere else mentally since yesterday afternoon. I filled him in on Derek's call, on the vulnerability my brother had finally allowed himself to show. James listened thoughtfully, then said, that must have taken courage for him to reach out. Shows growth maybe, or at least desperation strong enough to overcome pride. Yeah, I agreed. And it's a reminder that success and struggle aren't mutually exclusive. Derek made choices that looked safe and responsible but turned out to be traps. I made choices that looked risky and irresponsible but happened to work out. Neither of us had certainty at the time. We were just doing our best with the information and instincts we had. James nodded slowly. So what happens now with him? I shrug. He takes the referrals I gave him or he doesn't. He does the work to sort through his financial mess or he doesn't. That's on him. But at least now maybe we can have an actual relationship instead of this performance we've been doing where he pretends to be the successful older brother, and I pretend not to notice he's struggling. Maybe we can just be two guys trying to figure life out, and occasionally helping each other when we can. The weekend came and I found myself at the hangar where the helicopter lived, something I'd started doing when I needed to think. There was a meditative quality to the pre-flight checks, the methodical process of ensuring everything was functioning properly before taking to the air. The pilot I'd hired for the barbecue landing had connected me with an instructor who'd been helping me build my skills, and I'd been flying regularly, finding that the focus required left no room for the constant mental chatter of running a business. Today I took the helicopter up alone, climbing above Charlotte's sprawl until the city was just patterns and grids below. Up here, the problems that had felt overwhelming became manageable, part of a larger landscape rather than walls closing in. I thought about the contracts we'd committed to, the growth curve ahead, the hiring and infrastructure challenges waiting. Thought about Derek's confession and the strange twist of fate that had positioned me as someone he'd turn to for guidance. Thought about Mom and Dad's shifting perspective, their pride and regret intermingled in ways that would probably take years to fully process. But mostly I just flew, feeling the helicopter respond to subtle inputs, watching the sun angle toward evening and paint the sky in shades that no camera could quite capture. This was what I'd been working toward without fully realizing it, not just financial success or family validation, but this sense of freedom. The freedom to make choices based on what felt right rather than what others expected. The freedom to help or not help based on genuine assessment rather than obligation or resentment. The freedom to fly above it all literally and metaphorically, and see the bigger picture. When I landed as the sun touched the horizon, I felt settled in a way that had eluded me through the chaos of recent weeks. Monday would bring new challenges, the recruitment process and infrastructure planning and constant demands of delivering for clients who expected excellence. Derek would be navigating his own complicated path, either finding his way toward stability or sinking deeper into the consequences of choices made. Mom and Dad would continue adjusting to this new understanding of who I was and what I'd built. And through all of it, I'd keep moving forward, building something sustainable and meaningful and authentically mine. The helicopter sat cooling on the tarmac, this expensive symbol of achievement that represented so much more than transportation. It was proof of concept, evidence that the impossible could be made real through enough determination and work and strategic thinking. But more than that, it was a reminder that success looked different for everyone, that the path others approved of wasn't necessarily the right one, and that sometimes the biggest risks led to the most profound rewards. I locked the hangar and headed home, ready for whatever came next, confident that I'd built something strong enough to weather the growth ahead. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.